course of the COVID pandemic. To answer this question and more, I'm joined by Dr. Kat Lindley, who is a board-certified family physician from Texas. And what makes this conversation particularly interesting is the fact that this is not the first time that Kat has experienced an erosion of her freedoms. So in this conversation, we explore Kat's background, her story. We look at why people were so willing to give up their freedoms, but also end with a message of hope of what the future of healthcare may look like in the wake of COVID-19. I do hope you'll enjoy this episode. My name is Astin-Gregory. This is the Elevate podcast. If you're not yet part of our community, you can come and join us at weareelevate.org. And again, please do subscribe to the show on your favorite platforms. You can listen to us on all the audio platforms and catch us on YouTube, Rumble, and Odyssey, and more. Enjoy this episode today with Dr. Kat Lindley.
Kat, you were 18 when you left Croatia when it was under attack. You went via Italy and ended up in America, where you trained to become a physician. Mm-hmm. Do you think your experiences in your early adulthood impacted on your view of how COVID was unfolding and the public health measures as they unfolded within the United States? Is that something that, do you think, influenced your initial views on the situation?
It has, but actually started before COVID. Probably a couple of years before COVID, I decided to go independent, practice outside of the system. I left the corporate medicine, opened my own practice, and started advocating for developing the relationship between patient and physician, because I realized the only way we can truly fulfill our role is if we don't have someone behind our shoulders looking what we're doing. So when COVID happened, it was a little bit easier for me to start seeing things differently. Mm-hmm. And first, I worked in urgent care to supplement my income in my own practice. Urgent care was part of the hospital system. So they told us to not see the patient. They told us to tell patients if they get really sick, they can't breathe, go to the hospital. And that didn't make sense because I am family physician. I was working in urgent care, which is kind of a step before the emergency room. So it was my job to see these patients first and try to help them. And I would come home at the end of the night, and I was really anxious. I remember one time I was, taking a shower after a shift, and I started crying, thinking, what am I bringing home to my family? Because this was during that, when everyone was afraid. We're seeing stuff from China, from New York. And people always say, I knew from the beginning. I really question that. I think most of us didn't know from the beginning because they did a good job setting this panic, anxiety, fear. So one night I was speaking with a friend of mine who's also independent, and her mom was from Russia. So we have similar, experiences. And she goes to me, Kat, you're having flashbacks. And I thought about it, and then it's almost like, this light bulb moment. And I was like, yes, because what I recognized was fear, anxiety. And that was around the time when they told us only the first responders can leave. Everyone else had to stay home. There was no one at the stores. The roads were almost empty. And I started seeing patterns, which is fear, isolation. Mm. And then as it developed more and more, you went into that bargaining phase. If you stay 6 feet apart, you can, do this. If you wear a mask, you can do that. And then after the bargaining phase, we started with threats, which came with vaccines. If you get the vaccine, you can go to work and things like that. So I recognize these tactics that are really totalitarianism type regimes that do it. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of how it developed for me.
Yeah. So having seen those signals and witnessing those signals, how did your own behavior change within that context?
So professionally, it never did, from the beginning, other than the urgent care. Even in urgent care, I would tell my nurse, patient can come in, we can handle it. And then in my own practice, as the journals were coming, and I was already friends with Ryan Cole from our previous advocacy work, I started, following Peter and everyone else, and it was just kind of normal transition into this freedom medical movement in the States. So I treated patients from the beginning, and I saw the results. And one thing that never made sense was hydroxychloroquine narrative initially. So I don't mind sharing my personal medical history because it's not really a big deal. I have rheumatoid arthritis. So I take hydroxychloroquine 400 milligrams every single day. So when they said that giving patient 400 milligrams for 5 days is going to cause heart problems, it didn't make sense. Plus, I also gave this same dose to my other patients for years. So, you could see these little lies, story unfolding, and realizing that they really were suppressing the treatment because of the EUA, the emergency use authorization. If we have a treatment, then you don't have a need for EUA. Then the vaccines cannot be pre-approved for use. So it was very, it's hard to believe that other people didn't see it. And everyone always says, well, how did you guys see it? How did these people don't recognize it? I have no idea, because it's so blatantly out there. If you can treat, then there's no need for EUA, there's no need for the vaccines. And that's kind of where we were.
Yeah, I mean, the Operation Warp Speed, obviously we got to see that from the UK. It was a US-led initiative initially, and it was all about the vaccine. And we saw that very early on. There was no a process for approving drugs within that Operation Warp Speed, where you could take these pre-approved, previously approved drugs and repurpose them. It wasn't even part of the equation.
Yeah, we still do it. In diabetes, we use medications that weren't necessarily approved for neuropathy. In diabetes, they were approved in different neuropathies before, and we just always done it. It's not a problem. It's almost like doctors surrendered their diplomas and said, okay, we'll do whatever you want us to, because there was so much fear. And I think that's the biggest lesson I think we learned, is to truly turn off the TV, turn off this mainstream. And one thing that I realized, and that's why I always watched the world, I watched you guys very carefully, and I became friends with several people here in UK early on. It never happened that every country responded exactly the same. That doesn't make sense. Because you have to take a contest like what's happening in your country, what are the risk factors, what are the things that you do culturally, how do you adopt. We should have all kind of taken maybe overview of something that's working and say, okay, that's working there, let's try it here, but let's modify it. So this whole global response never made sense.
It raises a lot of questions for me about leadership, because I spent 10 years in corporate, well, nearly 10 years, and did a lot of work with leaders, and we did kind of crisis management training, and it was really interesting to see how people respond under those conditions of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And a lot of those patterns that we discovered in the corporate world played out on a global scale. And my concern about this is quite broad, but also narrow, because if you look at the way that the doctors and the medical community responded, it's almost exactly as you outlined. It's just follow the orders, as opposed to using one's own critical insight, one's own personal practice, and the regionalization, localization of treatment based upon your own knowledge of the conditions and also the patient and the local demographics. But none of that was applied. None of that critical thinking was applied. So do you think there's I spoke to a previous podcast guest who talked about this difference between linear thinking and lateral thinking, and this lateral thinking is usually responsible for challenging the status quo and looking for different ways to do things. Do you think the medical and scientific profession has kind of become very linear in its thinking? Has it become very process-driven to the point now where people have lost that kind of leadership critical faculty?
It has, at least in the United States. I would venture to say it's the same thing with NHS. What's happened in the United States is in education systems, they're starting, and hospitals, they're running these protocols. So if someone, and this was, I remember early on, probably about 4 or 5 years ago, they started changing definitions. So if someone comes to the hospital with high fever, there is a protocol for sepsis. When I was a medical student, sepsis meant that this patient has an overwhelming infection in many organs of the body, and because of that, the organs are failing. So whether it's kidneys, their liver, their blood pressure. So it's really an ill person, and you have to manage them very critically. Sometimes they don't make it because the sepsis is overwhelming. So all of a sudden, they changed this protocol, sepsis, which meant if someone has fever, elevated white count, which indicates infection, and a symptom of whatever, they go under sepsis protocol. And they start getting antibiotics right away, blood work, blood cultures, and there's a whole protocol they follow. So I had one of my patients went to the hospital. It was, maybe in her 20s or 30s, mom. She ended up having fever, swollen glands, and elevated white count. She has strep that she picked up from her child. She wasn't septic. She had these signs of sepsis parameters, like the ones that they outlined. But she wasn't septic in a true sense where her organs are failing, something I'm worried about. But they activated this protocol because they get paid more. Mm-hmm. We have Medicare system and different things, so you get these, when you have protocols, more boxes you check, you get paid more. So these things started developing more and more. We had pneumonia protocols, we had cardiac protocols, whatever. And it's as almost, I would say, physicians who were trained early on never stopped doing the critical thinking and figuring out what's causing these different things. But the new generation is learning to protocols. So they're just memorizing. When I came to the States and, I have 5 children and they started going to school, we have this Common Core math. I come from Europe. Math is always the same. I did calculus. Math is always the same. Numbers, you add them, whatever. In U.S., they teach children how to memorize to get to the result. But the steps for that, I'm not kidding you, it's a whole page of different things. So 16 plus 9, it's not 25, it's how do you get to 25? It's the ones and the tens and the whatever and whatever. So by doing these protocols even early on in our education with children, they're taking away that critical thinking. And I think that's what's happened to us in general.
Yes, and I think critical thinking, when it comes under those circumstances of fear, uncertainty and doubt, is often suppressed by that condition. But you've landed on a really important point, and I think underscores a global problem, not in every territory or country, but the incentive structures. If a hospital or a medical system is dependent upon certain sources of funding and certain treatments or protocols are weighted more significantly in terms of finances, there's a greater incentive to follow a certain pathway. Well, then surely, the doctors are going to follow that in order to maximize their own revenues, to ensure, in a world where, particularly here in the UK, the funding crisis around the NHS is something that's really bold in the news right now. So, of course, if there's ways to get government funding or other sources of funding, pharmaceutical funding, then those incentive structures surely will play a role in the decisions that physicians are undertaking. Do you think that's a factor that's played out here?
It is, but it's even beyond that. They actually get penalized. So a lot of times in systems, you work for RVUs, you get certain amount of points, and based on that, they get your salary and whatever. But if you don't meet certain requirements that they have, they can take some of those away. So that's why there's definitely an incentive to do things in a certain way, and if you don't do them, you get penalized. So you might actually not make your bonuses or different things. So for sure.
Now, we've talked about the medical profession and, your story of how you left Croatia, must have given you an overarching appreciation for freedom. But of course, it's not just the medical profession that was willing to forego those freedoms, medical freedoms, but the public at large. And again, we know that the fear would have played a major role, but why do you think the public was so willing to forego their freedoms under these circumstances?
So we were in Twitter Space together recently, a couple of weeks ago, and at the end I closed with something. I think it was February last year, February or March. I'm part of a Global COVID Summit group, and we do, we go around the country and spend like a day talking to people about what's going on. We were scheduled to go to, I think it was Tennessee. And on Monday, the Department of Homeland Security came with a proclamation that if you speak against the official narrative regarding COVID or elections, you will be considered a terrorist.
My goodness.
And I have a very big imagination. So in my mind, I'm thinking, we're going to have this event. There's going to be like FBI agents in the audience. I got all like crazy. And for about 3 days, it hit me really hard. I was afraid. I was anxious. I thought about not going. I spoke with several people, including Richard Urso and Ryan. And I was like, yeah, I'm not sure I want to go because I'm a mom of 5. You know, I'm a physician, but I'm a mom. That's my first job, right? And I was like, maybe I can't do it. So for 3 days, this was going on in my head. And the only thought that I had the whole time is I was born without a voice because in Yugoslavia, you were not really allowed to say you go to church. Religion in communism is not something that you talk about. So I remember as a kid, I was never supposed to say I go to church in school or around my dad's work or anything like that. So the only thing I could think during this time is, you know, I was born without a voice and my kids are going to die without a voice. You know, I mean, my kids are going to have to live their life without a voice. And it was really hard on me. So I recently posted on Twitter a question. I said, how much are you willing to give up for this elusive sense of safety? Because that's what we've done. To feel safe, we've given our freedom away. And I watched you guys, you've done the same things we've done. And I think the reason they caught us kind of in this place where we were willing to do that is because Western countries are naive to this idea of losing the freedom. Mm. You know, we've had a very complacent way of life. We take things for granted, and we never thought that unless you're in a war, in actual physical, some kind of conflict, that someone can take your freedom away. Another thing, I'm going to give you one more example, because I'm a huge Avengers fan. My kids and I were watching, we rewatch them all the time. But recently we watched again Captain America Winter Soldier. And Captain America goes with Widow to this bunker where they find a computer program run by this Nazi guy that came during the paperclip operation. And he's talking to this computer, to 2 of them, and he said, in the Second World War, we attacked you head on, and you fought really hard, and you won the war. But right now, Hydra, which is like the bad guys in Avengers, right now, all we had to do is make you fear it, and you gave it away. And that movie was made 5-6 years ago, and to hear that, it really hit me, kind of was like, whoa, that's exactly what happened. For this elusive feeling of safety, we gave it away. And we gave it away every time we said yes. The 2 weeks of lockdowns, extended, masking, 6 feet apart, getting vaccines so you can go to work or travel or whatever. We just kept on giving it away. And I think finally we're waking up and realize that this freedom is so important. It's the only thing that really keeps humans alive.
Yeah, it's such a powerful story, and it's really interesting. I was part of a discussion recently where they're exploring how movies over the years become a reflection of the culture that we live in, and that's a perfect embodiment of that. And one of our previous guests spoke how in the 50s and 60s movies typically had kind of a moral of a story with a happy ending where things actually prevailed. But since the 80s, we've seen this slide into kind of this kind of pandemonium of dark, apocalyptic endings, and it's so interesting just to see how our culture has shifted and how some of these forces have played out in the last couple of years. And where does that tell us about where the future is heading? I don't know. But you mentioned the Twitter conversation that we were part of. That was about freedom of speech. We were arguing that free speech saves lives. But obviously recently we've been aware that the Twitter files have been released. And, we've also seen in parallel with that, since Musk took the helm, we've seen many voices now having their voice restored. The power that a tech firm has to determine whether you can share a story or to share evidence or to share your views is this unprecedented power that's been wielded over this time. But these Twitter files are starting to blow by blow kind of reveal the inner workings of the machine. What has been your perception of what's happened more broadly with the censorship and your specific take on what we're learning from the Twitter files?
Well, I think we kind of were thinking it's happening, but this is, just kind of opened up this Pandora box, and now we're seeing it has. The biggest revelation from United States standpoint is that we've seen our government put pressure on these companies to actually censor. And that's actually, you can talk about Twitter censoring, Facebook censoring. We have something called 230 section or whatever, but private company can choose to censor people. That's kind of how they were getting away with it. But the government is not allowed because we have the free speech. So that's been very interesting. And I think watching it being revealed is one thing, but then watching our senators and congressmen not doing anything about it is another. This has really, and one good thing is some lawsuits that are happening. That Mississippi lawsuit and the one that Bobby Kennedy is doing. I think that's kind of where it's going to be revealed even more. And we're learning these things through these FOIs. The interesting thing was also watching Gottlieb. So he used to be in Trump's administration as one of the FDA administrators, and then he went to Pfizer. And he asked specifically Twitter to censor people talking about natural immunity, which we all knew from medical school that obviously natural immunity is the best way. You know that from the flu, from colds and things like that we get all the time. We have this natural immunity, and that's the way the body really knows how to handle things. So we've seen a lot of pressure from private organizations doing the same. And then this collusion between different organizations, FDA, CDC, they had people, definitely conflict of interest. The director of ethics, who is Dr. Fauci's boss, is his wife.
Yes.
So all of these things are getting revealed more and more. And hopefully that will actually get other side and people who are still kind of undecided to wake up, because no one likes conspiracies, no one likes, all these things. But I think seeing it black and white is going to be another tool that will help people wake up and kind of say, enough is enough.
No, I agree. I was part of a systemic change workshop over the weekend, over 2 days, and there's some really interesting revelations that are really applicable to this conversation. Firstly, that, the torchbearers is a kind of metaphor for those who are out there seeking to shed light on what's really happening. Mm-hmm. And within a crisis situation or an adverse situation like this, that torch-bearing role is often met with a lot of resistance. We've seen that with the censorship, but also the demeaning comments that are received and the ad hominem attacks that slander those that challenge the authorities. But historically, what's really interesting, what happens after this period of transformation during a crisis like this, there is the opportunity for the transference of authority. So those legacy authorities begin to crumble because the light is eventually shone on the cracks, and those cracks become bigger and bigger, and it leads to this wreckage where those that actually went out and pursued the truth are the ones that then, by default, de facto become the next wave of authorities, because trust is lost in the archaic institutions and the individuals that were represented, and then you have the new breakthrough organizations and individuals who are kind of trailblazing a new path forward. And it's my hope and it's my belief that's starting to happen now. And there's a few doctors that I follow on Twitter, and it's all they're doing right now is recycling the official narrative. They're showing the clips, the doctors saying and the medical officials saying that, anyone who takes this jab will not get infected, they will not be hospitalized, which we know from the beginning was not true. We know that from looking at the endpoints of the trials, that was never going to be true. But we've got the public record now, which will show that the authorities that have gone before us cannot be trusted, yet they're the ones that have been positioned as the official sources, and anyone else that goes against that has had their voices censored. So I think there is hope here, and I know you have had a particular interest in looking at solutions beyond this, how we reimagine the public healthcare system. And you're not alone in that. I think it's fantastic. A lot of people are now pioneering and imagining where we can go from this, which perhaps illustrates what I've just shared. So, is there do you have an optimistic view of the future? And if so, based upon what we're still going through now, what time horizon are we thinking of before things start to really turn?
Yes and no, and I'll start maybe with a no. There's so much corruption, and I would say especially on the leadership level, in every country. The WEF is meeting in Davos, and all our leaders are going there to listen to them and things like that. I think we need to demand better of the public leaders that are representing us. And I think we need to truly try to return that sense to them of community.
Yes.
That they realize that they are in a position they are because we chose them to be. So I think there needs to be accountability there, and I think we need to demand it. One thing I do caution all of us is not to be too proud about it. Sure, we were right from the beginning, but we all made mistakes along the way and learned and adapted. So we need to give everyone grace. You need to people that are coming into the fold and realizing they've done wrong. Welcome them, make them realize what they did wrong. Don't forgive them that whole thing about give them a pass or whatever. That's nonsense because they affected many lives. But let's figure out having that conversation because that's what's been lost. From the medical standpoint, the trust is completely broken. Mm. But there are still good doctors out there in NHS system, in United States, everywhere. I think what we need to try to do for them, I'm outside of the system, I've lived outside of it, and I'm happy. I'll give just an overview of what I do. I have a monthly membership that's affordable. And I can see my patients. They know they can be seen 24/7. Everyone has my cell phone. There are days I don't even go to the office because they don't abuse that relationship. And they know that if they need me, I'm there. So that's one model. There are other models where maybe every time you go see a doctor, you pay a nominal fee, whatever that is. But we need to start thinking outside of the box because system itself is broken. Medicine is really not expensive. Getting labs in the United States, I know here is a little different, but in the United States, we do have that free market where you can go to private labs, private x-rays. You have compound pharmacies that are outside of the big chains, so you can get better prices. That's definitely something that UK needs to start looking into. You guys have some amazing business people. Figure out how to go through these regulations to start creating outside labs, radiology, and pharmacy. And then the doctors can live outside of the system where they truly have this relationship with a patient. Because I do have a lot of friends who are physicians here, and that's what they want to do. Medicine is not expensive, but healthcare is a business. It's a bureaucracy. It's there to make money for someone, whether that's the government or private entities. It's not there to make money for physician or the patient. I know that doctors have been vilified that they're making money and all of that. Sure, they do, but not to the extent that people behind make money. So we need to take that middleman out. You need to totally take that out, whichever way you can do it, and then just doctor and patient. I love reading books and I read a lot of different things, and I do remember these surgeries in UK where the doctor was independent, maybe had a nurse, and patient had directly see them. We need to go back to those type of systems, and there is not one solution. This is something where these entrepreneurs, people, they need to start thinking outside the box, and you start in your community. People always say, how do we get out of this whole mess? How do we break the hold that WHO has on us, WEF, our government? Starts at home, and you have a little boy at home. Starts with your wife and him, you teaching him values, and then finding a good school for him, finding the community for him, and then spreading that out. Creating this safe net around you. The people where you go buy your food, you go to the fresh market, you create relationships, and it just really goes back to that relationships.
Yes, I think that decentralized approach is really the way to really counter this over-centralized dominance of these power structures. I think that's such an important component of this. And I think in the UK, there's been such a reverence for the NHS over the time. We saw it during the pandemic. That often when people talk about private solutions to these things, it's an emotive subject, but I think it's driven by what people perceive to be the privatization of the NHS, which is exactly the problems actually we've been talking about, which is where corporate interests and the pharmaceutical companies have this overarching dominance over the structures. And I think more and more people are now willing to explore different solutions. The NHS right now, it's probably at its lowest point in history, and the consequences of which are now being felt dramatically, not just by the healthcare system, but by those trying to seek healthcare solutions. I recently was made contact with my GP, told that nearest appointment is in 40 days' time.
I was just going to say that.
40 days.
Are you willing to pay maybe, I don't know, £20 or whatever to see someone this afternoon.
Well, absolutely, I would be, yes.
Exactly. And like for me, we call my system direct primary care, so it's actually affordable.
Yes.
My patients, I don't know how much this is in, but just to give you an idea, pay anywhere from $35 to $110 a month. $35 is what, 40 pounds?
Yes.
And you can be seen anytime, as many times as you need to. And if I cannot see you today because I'm in London, I text right away and I'll see you as soon as I get back, or I can find someone to see them. There is no, the wait at the most is maybe 24 hours, but I've never even done that. So you have to start thinking outside the box. How much is your health worth to you?
Yes.
If you are, like if your son was to have strep and you can't get to see a doctor for 7 to 10 days, he could develop complications. And that system is broken.
Yes, I think we do need to look at where we spend our money. And I know the big argument is always going to be about those, particularly under now with the cost of living crisis, the argument will always be, how do you make it accessible?
There always have to be solutions for people like that too. You have to have some kind of venue where the government does subsidize or certain things. So that's why I say it's not one solution. There has to be parallel solutions working together, figuring out which way to do it.
Yes. Kat, there's so much I'd like to explore with you, but I know we're tight on time. Is there any final reflections you would like to share before we wrap up? Anything that's front of mind for you right now?
So I would just say, look back at these past couple years. And again, it goes back to what I said earlier. How much are you willing to give for that elusive feeling of safety? How much are you willing to just give away? And you have to realize that freedom, whether that's a freedom of choice, freedom of decisions that you make when it comes to your family, your kids' education, whatever it is, you have to realize that that's so fragile and so important, and we have to keep it.
Thank you, Dr. Kat Lindley here on the Elevate podcast. It's been a real pleasure hosting you here today, and I hope you enjoy your time here in the United Kingdom and your onward travels. I know you're very, very busy, like many of the doctors and scientists now, traveling the world to raise awareness to these key issues. So it's a blessing and an honor that we've had you here today. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode with Dr. Kat Lindley. I had the opportunity to meet with Kat in London to record this episode. And in addition, I met with Dr. Ryan Cole. Now, Dr. Ryan Cole's episode was broadcast several days ago, and already that episode has been pulled by YouTube, where Dr. Cole shared his views on Operation Warp Speed, the risks associated with using mRNA in the new vaccines, and much, much more around the protocols that were used during COVID, why treatments were suppressed. So it's undoubtedly clear that this challenges the very narratives that YouTube and mainstream media are still not willing to address. So if you'd like to see that episode and more, you can view the episode uncensored inside of our private Elevate community. You can join us over at weareelevate.org, where every single month you'll get pre-release material before we broadcast our episodes live to the public. So thanks very much again for tuning in. I do hope you'll join us inside the Elevate community, and I'll see you on the next episode of the Elevate podcast.